So let's talk a little bit about what we're seeing and what's happening to the state as a whole, to where that might fall in for this for Castle Rock. I think it's always important to understand some big trends and see what's going on. And one of the biggest components that we're seeing right now is that we're continuing to grow, but at a slowing rate. And what does that mean for Castle Rock and for the state as a whole? We're seeing a lot of concentrated growth, and I think that's maybe the biggest takeaway to watch, is that we're seeing this concentrated growth along the I-25 corridor, and obviously you guys are right in the middle of that. And so, well, maybe not center in the middle of it, but you're definitely part of that concentrated growth. We're starting to get a lot of questions across the state about migration and how many people do we want to continue to attract and retain. And I'm going to be talking to you guys maybe a little bit from the positive side of migration, because we tend to hear in the media a lot more on the negative side rather than on the positive side. Talk a little bit about aging, because it's really important, because we do it every day, and how that's going to impact our communities and our economy and where we move into the future. Talk a little bit about increasing race and ethnic diversity, because that's what we're also seeing, especially at our youngest ages. A little bit of slowing in income growth, but that really is just demographics. So it's not a bad thing, it's really explainable. And then making sure that we really understand the impacts of changes to industries to our communities. And I think, and that's where I'll actually highlight a lot of the positives that I think have been going on in both Douglas County as well as Castle Rock, in terms of diversifying a little bit and becoming a little bit, the key word right now is resilient. That it used to be known as sustainable, and then before that it was just called good planning. So really looking at what Castle Rock has done, I think, to become a little bit more resilient in terms of its economic base. So always it's important to remember that Colorado is part of the United States, right? And so it's a little geography 101. So it's always important to remember that whatever's happening to the US as a whole will impact Colorado wherever we go out into the future. So if we look at the US as a whole, we are at about 327 million. We increased by this about 2 million people a year. It's a 0.6 annual average growth rate. And I think last time I was here, I had mentioned, I'm like the slowest growth rate in the United States since the Great Depression in the 1930s. I've said that now 3 years in a row, and each year it's consecutively slower. So would you believe that? Would you believe that we're slowing for the US as a whole? Sometimes if you're living in Castle Rock or anywhere in the Denver metro area, you wouldn't necessarily believe that. We are the 7th fastest growing state behind some really big states, 1.4 annual average growth rate. Quick math, over twice as fast as the US as a whole. 8th in total growth, increasing by about 80,000 this last year, again behind some really big states. Just for perspective, how much do you think Texas increased by this last year? In total numbers, 350,000 people. So when we whine sometimes about 80,000, just put that into perspective. I realize, yes, larger geography, but it's important to understand that difference. Also interesting, I'm going to throw California in there for a second. Its growth rate this last year was 0.3% annual average growth rate, their slowest growth rate since the year 1900. So California's slowing, we're slowing, the US is slowing down in terms of growth. But we've got a huge range within the state. We had some counties increasing, some counties declining, and just kind of the top set of county growth within the metro area or the Front Range area, we can see where Douglas County as a whole came in as number 4 this last year, Weld, Adams, Arapahoe coming in that top group. If we look across the state from 2010, all of the red, orange, yellow counties are counties that have increased in population. All of the shades of blue have declined. So we've got about a quarter of our counties declining in population. And I know here within Douglas County and a lot of the Front Range, we really worry about how do you manage growth and how do you manage services when you've got so many more people. But imagine, just for a second, what it would be like to try and manage when you've got a declining population. How do you manage your water systems, your road systems, your public services like schools, healthcare services when you've got a decline. So it's important, I think, even though we're in the midst of a lot of growth here, that to realize that there are some parts of the state that are declining, and maybe there's some ways to think about how do we partner better with the rest of the state to see what opportunities there are. When we look at total population change, there's two components. One is called natural increase, which is the blue component on the bottom. That's births minus deaths. So again, I'm going to say it one more time, births minus deaths. So you should be thinking in your head that is a baby on the chart, okay? That blue is a baby, it's births minus deaths. The red component is net migration, the ins minus the outs. If we look over time, we can see in the 70s we had 1 year where we had growth over 100,000. In the 90s into the early 2000s, we had 7 years of growth over 100,000. Since 2001, Colorado has not increased by over 100,000. Yet, what do you hear in the media all the time? Unprecedented growth, right? I call it short-term memory loss. We have way been there before, and much stronger growth in the past. And in fact, Douglas County had a lot more growth and percentage growth in the past than we are right now in terms of the growth within the state. So, and again, remember those are babies in the blue. We also hear over 100,000 more drivers on the road. I'm like, no. We don't give licenses at that age. They may be in the car or in the house, but they are not the ones that are really buying or driving. So it's important for that perspective to see where we are in terms of time. One of the things I think I do want to mention, though, is that we can see this slowdown in the natural increase. And that's one of the things that's driving down our growth for the state as a whole. When we look at it, I think it's really important to remember it because of how important retail is to Douglas County as well as Castle Rock. We need to always understand who our base is, who our population is. And so what we've seen is this decline in births over time. We had peak births in 2007 and have declined since then. And we're about 7,000, 6,000, 7,000 fewer births per year. Yet we've got 666,000 more people in the state. So birth rates have really plummeted. Not a bad thing because it's been a decline in teen birth rates, which all across the spectrum is important to push down teen birth rates. So that's not a bad thing. But it's important to remember that because obviously Toys R Us did not check in terms of having to close so many of their retail establishments. And it's not just in Colorado where we've seen this decline in births or slowdown in births, it's across the US. So again, important to be thinking, who is my market? Who am I trying to attract and retain? And who am I providing services for? We can also see on the bottom, we have an increase in deaths, not because there's a weird plague. There is just a larger share of our population in age groups that have higher death rates. And this is just absolutely normal. This is what we typically do over time, and we've done it historically, and we're continue to see that increase over time. I want to show just real quickly, again, that same chart, then with our net migration on top, which is the green, just to show that really over time, it is babies, even though they're slowing down, that create the most change in our population. A lot of times we love to pick on migrants, people that come to Colorado from another state or another country. But it's babies that create the most change, not migration. Now, just a quick question. How many of you are not native Coloradoans? So when we say under our breath, oh, those gosh darn migrants. Remember, we're talking about our friends, right? Our friends and our colleagues here. If we look for Douglas County as a whole, I think it's really important to look at this chart. Again, this gray line right here is net migration, and we can see where you guys were really in the 90s, very much slowing down in through the 2000s and through the 2010s in terms of net migration. The green here are your births, where we've seen a decline in births as well, or a slowdown in births, and then a slight increase in the amount of deaths. Again, you tend to be a younger county. When we look at Douglas County as a whole, we can see since 2010 about an increase of 16,000 in terms of the total population for Castle Rock. For Douglas County as a whole, about 55,000. Different growth rates across the spectrum. Don't panic about the Aurora part of Douglas County. They're growing, but it's a small base that they've started with. But we can see that again, Castle Rock and Lone Tree right growing at about 3.6%, which is much faster than really the area as a whole. But in terms of total numbers, it's your unincorporated area, which also includes Highlands Ranch that is in that growth area. When we migrate people to Colorado, what kind of folks do we migrate? We migrate youngins, and this is the age distribution of our migrants across the time. We can see really our bread and butter is about 18 to 37 is our net migrants to Colorado. We don't get a ton of movement at older age groups. There's a little bit of movement right here around 65, but that's it. Douglas County is a smidge different, right? So you lose a lot of young adults. Why?
Can't afford it.
Can't afford it. Maybe leaving for college, leaving for the first opportunities, but that's the first thing that we always talk about when we look at a place like Douglas is what would it take to retain that population? Why do we need to lose them, especially youngins? We don't get a lot of movement in the 40s and the 30s. It's really starts slowing down. So if you really want a very successful 40-year-old, a lot of times what you have to do is migrate or bring in or retain a 20-year-old and then grow them over time to create that successful 40-year-old. Obviously, you guys do get a lot of people at the older age, in the 30s and 40s. I know. I did not mean that at all. Older than the really young. How about that? And they bring their kiddos here, so you can kind of see that. Again, very different than, let's say, a Denver County, where they very much concentrated on the kind of the 20 to 30-year-olds, and they have out-migration from basically 30 on up. I know, it's weird. Totally different kind of community than Douglas County. When we migrate people to Colorado, what kind of folks where do they come from? Well, the darkest colored states are the largest donors. So our largest donors tend to be California, Texas, Florida, Arizona, and Illinois. And believe it or not, people also leave the state and go to other states. We were first explaining this to someone in the legislature a couple of years ago. They're like, people leave Colorado? Oh, yes, they do. And where do they go? California, Texas, Washington, Arizona, and Florida. So all we're doing really is trading everybody back and forth between these large states. Illinois, New York, California, Virginia, and Florida were the net donors, largest net donors in this year, 2016, which is the last year that we have the data available. But in any one year, we will have anywhere between 170 to 230,000 people moving in and about 150 to 100,000 moving out. More than anything, it's important to remember that our migrants tend to be younger, lower income, but don't panic because what are they? Younger. Younger people tend to make less than older people and tend to have higher educational attainment than the Colorado average. If we look at the country and look at the donors for Douglas County, the red and yellow, or the darkest color, orange and yellow, are the states or the counties that are donating the most people. So if we look across the US, we can see which counties actually donate the most to Douglas County. It ends up being that your largest donors really are within state. So Jefferson, Arapahoe, and Adams tend to be in that top three. Then we've got Fairfax, Virginia. Then we've also got Chesapeake City, Virginia, Prince William, Virginia. All right, so how many of you guys are from Virginia? One. That's it? What a horrible sample you guys are. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. But so we can see that definitely coming from the East Coast. Then we can also see Georgia, Illinois, California in that grouping. Again, these guys look like they're donating more just because they're larger sized counties, but not necessarily because there are more people. Why do people move here? Why do people move to Colorado? Jobs. Over time, we've always seen this. As we have stronger job growth shown in the blue, we have stronger net migration shown in the orange. And that is a relationship that we will always see. Stronger job growth, stronger in migration. But what are we talking about a lot right now in terms of the US as a whole and Colorado as a whole? Thinking that we're not a fan of people. You know, I can't tell you how many times there's articles in the paper like, you know what, I think Colorado's full. I think we've got too many people. And I'm thinking to myself, oh, I'm a demographer. We love people. Why would we be anti-people? And they're like, well, you know what? They're on our roads. They're in our houses. I'm like, yeah. I'm like, but what do you think about jobs? They're like, oh, man, I'm a huge fan of jobs. I'm like, all right, go with me. A job is a person. House is where that job sleeps at night. How do you not be a fan of people when you're a fan of jobs? Maybe we just need to do a better job of accommodating both the jobs and the people together, because we're not going to go down to zero job growth. We will always then get the people. And we don't really want to go down to zero job growth. Because if we go down to zero job growth, that means things are really bad. And how many people had fun during the recession? No hands? No one had fun? So let's just, I guess, remember that in terms of this parallel between job growth and population growth. So let's talk about jobs in Colorado as a whole from 2008, so pre-recession peak levels, to current. Health services, professional and technical services, accommodations, food service, and transportation and warehousing, followed by state government, were the top 5 fastest growing industries in the state. By far, health services outpaced everything else. It's color-coded by wage rate, purple being mid, red being low, green being high. If we look for the state as a whole, we had about 36% low-wage job growth, 43% mid-wage, and only about 21% high-wage growth. So really dominated by the low and the mid for the state as a whole. Now, if we look how different counties are doing in the metro area, we can look at, what I did is I indexed everything to 2005 and grew all of the counties going forward from there. Adams and Douglas are right here in this, pink being Adams, blue being Douglas. And I had to kind of separate them because they started joining up here. But what we can see is that really Adams and Douglas by far led the Front Range and the metro area in terms of job growth for over a decade. Prior to the recession and then after the recession in terms of gaining. And we can see over basically almost 50% more jobs than existed in 2005. So this is pretty significant in terms of the impact of Douglas County to the entire metro area. If we look then in terms of the types of jobs that Douglas County has been growing since 2008, again dominated professional and technical services being number 1, health services being number 2, finance, retail trade, admin and waste, and then accommodations and food service. Again, the same color coding, but almost opposite from the state as a whole, dominated by mid and high compared to mid and low that the rest of the state showed up. But it's important to see that there were a lot of low-wage jobs created as well. So in terms of thinking about housing, have we been creating housing in these same proportions? Housing for low wage, housing for mid wage, and housing for high wage. And I think that's an important perspective to always look at. When we then look a little bit deeper into Castle Rock itself in terms of understanding the parallel between jobs and commuting maybe, or jobs and housing, the large light green circle is your labor force. And that's the size of your labor force. Your labor force is larger than the total number of jobs in Castle Rock. And this is just literally the boundaries of Castle Rock. The darker green circle is then the total jobs in Castle Rock. Where they intersect is where people live and work in the same place, so in Castle Rock. So not a lot of overlap. And we talked about this last time I was here, that is maybe one of the biggest challenges, is that there is a lot of commuting, that a lot of the people that live here don't work here, and we can see most of them that don't end up going into Denver, Centennial, Aurora, Greenwood Village, Lakewood. You can see that top list, but primarily going north, a little bit at the bottom end going then out to Parker. Again, dark green jobs are the ones that we've got now. Important thing to be thinking about then in terms of looking at jobs and how things have changed over time is, last time I was here I was talking about the proportion of jobs in the different areas, in the different industries. And one of the things that we've seen is that you do have a large share of retail trade, but over time, since 2005, again, when we were starting to look at these pieces, some of your fastest growing areas have been actually educational services, finance and insurance, information, and healthcare, all growing by over 5% annual average growth rate in that time frame. So really where you've been growing the majority of jobs has been in these higher areas, especially healthcare and professional business services, which tend to be at that higher wage rate. And this is within Castle Rock itself. So when I was mentioning before in terms of diversification, instead of having such a high concentration in both government and retail trade, both of those two sectors have shrunk over time, which is good, and shrunk in terms of a share, and growing in these other diverse areas. That way, again, trying to improve the sustainability, the resiliency, just the diversification of the area as a whole. So I will talk about age, because one of the biggest concerns, not the biggest concerns, but one of the biggest things that we have happening in this state is that we're celebrating birthdays every year. And you would think, how is that bad? And it isn't. This is what we always do. We celebrate birthdays every year, but we've got a lot of folks in that 60-year-old age group, all celebrating birthdays and aging forward. And you think, well, that's good, right? Yes, that's good, but we all change our preferences, our behaviors, what we do by age. And thank goodness, right? Again, I told you I've got an 18 and a 21, and I hope they change their preferences over time, right? And certainly you're probably not doing the same things that you did at 20, that you did at 40, that you're maybe doing at 60, and then you can think about your parents and grandparents in terms of their behavior and how they shop. But that's why age is the most important variable for anybody to look at, because you buy differently, you shop differently, you spend differently, you earn differently, you use housing services differently based on age. And as a municipality, sales tax is really important. And so if people spend differently over time, it's important to know that and know that how that could impact your economy. So this is Colorado's age distribution. We've got it broken down by generation over time. We've got our boomers here in the purple, our Gen X in the green, our millennials in the red, our next generation, our post-millennials in the blue, and then our next generation in the brown. Can you believe we have 2 generations past the millennials, and all we talk about are the millennials? I know, they're so famous. You will also see that the peak millennial was born in 1990. They are currently in that age group between 29 and 30. We can also see this downward trajectory in terms of total population at these younger ages. So this is significant. When I said that there was a slowdown in births, there is a slowdown in births, and we can see it across the state. This is Douglas. Did you guys have a slowdown in births? Just a little. Your peak age group right now is between 15 and 16. I am so sorry. That is such a bummer. No, they'll be fine. You'll be fine. But you can see this significant slowdown in youngins. And that's important to be thinking about, because next year there's actually going to be fewer 16-year-olds, which is maybe good. And then fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer coming through the system. But you will have a growth kind of in this group right here unless they all leave, which they have in the past. Your peak is not the millennials. Your peak is the Gen X. 50-year-olds is your peak population in Douglas County. We can see this line at 65, and these folks every year are marching toward that 65 line. Not that anything dramatic happens at 65, it's just another birthday. It's the best data set we get out there because people sign up for Medicare. And so we've got good data, and that's why that line is there, not because I'm expecting you to retire or do anything weird at 65, it's just the best data that we've got. But we do know that people participate in the labor force differently at different age groups. So that is something to be thinking about, is that impact over time. This is Denver. Again, their migration pattern has led to this, where your migration pattern has led to this. So we can see, again, that difference over time. In terms of growth rates for the state as a whole, our fastest growth in Colorado is going to be our retired population, 75 to 84. Those going into retirement, 23% in that 65 to 74. Our Gen X, as they're aging into the 55 to 64, is going actually negative. We can see our kiddos only growing at 2%. Total state only increasing by 10%. And this is looking at the time frame from 2018 to 2025. So we can see this stronger growth at the older end and our slower growth at the younger end. And that makes a big difference on the labor force and spending. Tell me something about the 45 to 64-year-olds. Highest earning, highest spending, highest property tax paying, and they are not growing the fastest. It is the 75 plus that tend to have the lowest spending on goods that are taxed, lowest earning, lowest property tax paying. So again, this is a big transition for the state as well as the county. This is Douglas. Actually forecast to have a decline in kiddos over this time frame. Fastest growth in the 75 to 84-year-olds, 83%. How many of you guys are planning for this? How many of you are in business providing services to the 75 plus? None? One, two, three, four. You guys win, right? Since when does your market increase by over 6% per year? Think about that. How many of you have businesses that are targeting the under 18? One. That might be good, that there's only one. Because this market is, again, forecast to slow down. We are forecasting almost every single county in the state to show a decline in the population under 18 between 2010 and 2020, just because of this slowdown in births. Pretty amazing. So we're aging really fast because we're really young. And you're like, what? It's Thursday. We're aging really fast because we're really young. We don't have a lot of older people. We're the third fastest growing state and the sixth youngest in terms of our share of the population over 65. Our 65 plus forecast to increase from 700,000 to 1.2 million. Huge economic impact. Where do people over the age of 65 spend their dollars? Healthcare. And? Come on.
Nursing home.
Well, that's healthcare, nursing home, travel, and eating out. There's a blue light special for a reason. I know that's terrible to say, but I'm going to pick on my mom because I can. She goes to Panera's 4 days a week. She loves it, right? Salad and soup. She's set. It's really close to the house. My mom and everybody else's mom. Two fastest growing industries, healthcare and accommodations food service. There is no reason why we didn't know this. We knew that this was going to be our fastest growing industry because that's where people over the age of 65 spend their dollars. There's data that shows it, and we've been doing it, and that's the fastest growing industries in the state. So it's important to recognize that this happens. And when people start talking about, you know what, we need to be growing good jobs. And I'm like, what do you mean good jobs? They're like, you know, that's stuff for like eating out isn't important. Those are bad jobs, they're low wage. And I'm like, all right, so my mom would differ with you. She's a fan of Panera, she's gonna be going to Panera, she wants that Panera employee there. How is that not a good job? So we need to think about why jobs are growing and that there's some things that we're just not gonna change, especially related to demographics. Huge impact in terms of the labor force, and that would be one thing that I would be thinking about a lot in Douglas County, is that you've got a lot of folks in the 50-something age group, and they will be retiring at some point. So understanding where they're gonna be. Housing, older adults tend to be primarily owners, so we can see that area. Downward pressure on income, I've already talked about. Health and disabilities, we've also talked about. Transportation is different as well. You've got right now a bunch of commuters that might now become just sitters. Not sitters, but they'll be staying in county, in city, and maybe not be driving as much to their commuting job, but they may be driving around town a lot more. So understanding traffic patterns is going to be important as well. Quickly, just real quick, talk about race and ethnicity. We're forecast to become more racially, ethnically diverse, growing from about 85% right now, white non-Hispanic, shrinking to about 55% white non-Hispanic by 2040. Largest growth in our people of color is going to be increasing from about 10% in 1970 of the Hispanics to about 33% by 2040 in terms of Hispanic. Now we know Douglas County is a little less diverse than the state as a whole. However, your young population is actually a lot more diverse than our older population, and for the state as a whole as well. Right now, if we look by age and by race and ethnicity, our under 18 population is 43% people of color. Our 65 plus is only about 16%. By 2050, for the state as a whole, we're forecasting basically almost every single age group under the age of 44 to be over 50% people of color. Why does this matter? One, educational attainment is really different by race and ethnicity. There's about a 35-point difference between white non-Hispanic and Hispanic in terms of, this is looking at associate's degree, just associate's degree plus. Our largest growth in workforce will be Hispanic. Over 65% of the increase in our labor force, almost 70%, Hispanic, just in the short run between 2015 and 2020. If they aren't prepared, who's going to take our job? This is for the state as a whole. Okay. And yes, Douglas is a little bit less diverse, but we need to be looking at the state as a whole because Douglas will only be really as successful as the rest of the state. It's about 10 points different 10 percentage points different for Douglas County compared to the state average. So like right now, the state is about 30% people of color and Douglas is about 20% people of color. So it's that difference. But this is huge. Because what are we talking about a lot of times in areas? Oh, all those people. Well, if we don't prepare our own population, we will be migrating even more to the state if we're not all prepared. So I think there's a lot that we can do as a whole. So in terms of our forecast for the state, as I mentioned before, we're starting to slow down, and this is showing that slowdown. Slowdown in natural increase, slowdown in net migration. Except for increasing net migration in the short run. Why are we forecasting an increase to net migration? Because we're celebrating birthdays. We have got about 1 million people in the state forecast to age out of the labor force in the next 10 years. 10 years, 1 million. And that's applying longer labor force participation rates. So we think about migrating people in to fill new jobs that we're creating, but we're actually going to be creating more jobs from people leaving the labor force and retiring than even job creation. We're creating right now about 55,000 new jobs for the state as a whole, about 60,000 from retirement. So about total 115,000 jobs are created. Are we ready? That's why we're forecasting this increase in net migration to the state over this time period. But you can see forecast is slow. So we're forecast to increase from about that 5.7 million that we're currently at to about 8.1 million by 2050. Wait a minute, didn't I say it's slower? If you did the math, that's 2.4 million people. Yuck, right? And all along the Front Range. So how many of you guys like Friends? Yeah? Only one of you likes Friends. That's nice. Thank you for raising your hand. I appreciate that. Important to be thinking about that all of this growth, most of it is going to be along the Front Range. If we look at a map of the state, we take that 2.4 million people, 2 million along the Front Range, 1 million in the Denver metro area, about 600,000 up north, 400,000 down south, with the remaining state coming up with the rest of the 400,000. The grayed out counties, flat to declines, unless something changes. Over almost a half of the counties forecast to be flat or declines. Crazy. This is this concentrated growth. So when we're thinking about this Denver metro area, I had mentioned this before, El Paso, almost 400,000. Oh, and that's a neighbor. 200,000 in Arapahoe. Oh, that's a neighbor. 300,000 in Adams. Close by neighbor. 180,000 in Denver itself. About 300,000 up north in Weld. It's really important to be thinking about what is Castle Rock doing to plan for this growth and accommodate it and not allow it just to happen, but to help manage where it is and how you deal with it, because 25 is the corridor that you will see a lot of this growth taking place on. So am I right? Probably not. Sorry. No. It's a forecast. It's based on our current information, and we know that things can change over time. One of the biggest things that we've seen over time is housing supply and price is not as competitive in the US as it used to be. We are going across the state with jobs being unfilled because people can't afford to live here. We've got the 5th highest median home value in the US. We also don't know what's going to be going on with national growth policies and international migration policies. That could either slow things down or pick things up. Water, huge issue, definitely an issue in Douglas County. Infrastructure, transportation, certainly a problem. There are firms that are now leaving Colorado because they can't get from point A to point B because it's too costly to operate here. Aging, industry changes, natural disasters, any of those things can really impact what this forecast is. Who were the largest donors to Colorado? Do you remember in terms of states? California, Texas, Florida.
Illinois.
So the only one really, Illinois doesn't have a natural disaster going on, but those other three who have had some really devastating natural disasters the last couple of years. All three of them, Texas, Florida, and California. Could we get more of them? Sure. Yeah, easily. Now, do we have our own natural disasters? Yes, but they rarely are in the Front Range. I mean, we definitely had the Colorado Springs, El Paso County issues, and then the flooding in Boulder in that area as well. But natural disasters could actually bring more people here. So in total, think about population growing but slowing, and how do you manage both? Definitely thinking about this slowing burst, especially in Douglas County, because that is a significant change, as well as aging. Both sides really important to be thinking about. Thinking about this concentrated growth, and maybe how do we do things better? How do we partner with some of our friends on the Eastern Plains and create great business opportunities for both Douglas and maybe Southeast Colorado? Thinking about what opportunities are out there. Looking at aging, looking at migration, and how do we talk about migration differently? That it's not the person's fault that they're here, thinking about the job and thinking about how do we manage both better. Aging, certainly, we need to be looking about how do we manage aging and provide services, looking at labor force participation, looking at this aging out of the labor force. Does Douglas County or even Castle Rock have an aging plan in place? Anybody know? Something maybe to be thinking about since you are one of the fastest aging counties. Sorry. It's all good. It's birthdays. Just think about it in the positive sense. It's birthdays. It means cake and ice cream. Race and ethnicity, becoming more racially and ethnically diverse and looking at how do we make improvements there. And then, of course, looking at what are your risks. And again, I think that this is the one area where Castle Rock has actually done a significant improvement over time that you can see becoming more diverse. Maybe it's just because it's a larger community now, but in terms of attracting different industries here to the community. How many of you are excited about Census 2020? 1, 2, 3. All right. How many of you are excited about Census 2020? All right, that was a little bit better. Thank you. Why do we care about Census 2020? Representation. We may get an 8th seat. And where's it going to be coming from? The metro area. So this is really important that we get everyone counted for that 8th seat. It also means a lot of money. Federal funds are distributed based on census count. Colorado gets about $13 billion a year based on our census count. Colorado is a net donor, right? We pay more in on federal taxes than we receive as a state. It's important that every person is counted so that we get those dollars. On average, it's about $2,300 per person that we get annually based on our census count. It's really easy. It's 10 questions, 10 minutes. It's online, by phone, paper, or in person, depending on what you're interested in. And everything is protected in terms of it is the most safe survey out there. And you guys have a handle on this because of your connection with people in the community. Letting them know about how important it is, how easy it is, and how safe it is really fundamental to all of the work that we do and that you guys do. There's a lot of resources available as well. Come on our website. We've got a website, demography.dola.colorado.gov/census 2020. You can just Google Census 2020 Colorado and come up with the same thing. We've got 2 different grant programs or 2 different financing programs out there. One is a grant. You can look on the website. The RFP is out right now. Due date is in September 15th. $6 million that the legislature made available for marketing and outreach. So it's looking at big projects that you could do across the state to reach all of your community. We also have a smaller support program, and I've got some information over here that is $2,500 per community to support outreach and marketing. So if you're looking at getting t-shirts or banners or something for the schools, for back to school or statistics in the school, this is some of the stuff that we can help support on our end. So with that, thank you guys very much. I appreciate it.